Well, it is the final day of the G7 summit as heads of state gathered at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial for a photo op. Leaders of the leading world economies have held discussions regarding some of the most pressing geopolitical issues like the war in Ukraine and belligerent China. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also made a surprise visit to Hiroshima on Saturday and met G7 leaders. He is expected to brief leaders today on what Kyiv needs for a ramped-up offensive against Moscow that he has said will create the conditions for a resolution to the conflict. Last evening, the leaders of the Quad Group, which include Australia, India, Japan and the United States, held a meeting on the sidelines of the G7. The four nations in a joint statement called for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific maritime domain without mentioning China directly. The leaders said that they strongly oppose destabilizing or even unilateral actions that seek to change the status quo in the region by force or coercion. Meanwhile, a number of bilaterals are also scheduled to take place today. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida held talks with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol to improve ties amid regional concerns. U.S. President Joe Biden is also scheduled to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today and hold a joint meeting with the leaders of South Korea and Japan, and that's according to U.S. officials. The three nations are reportedly expected to discuss ways to deepen their ties, including military interoperability. The countries will also discuss the economic coercion they face from China. The G7 meeting comes amid a shadow of a looming debt crisis and other domestic issues for President Biden, which has led to doubts over the ability of the United States to keep its international commitments. The latter half of his trip post-G7 had to be scrubbed so that President Biden could return to Washington early and resume talks on debt ceiling. And for more on this, we are now being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhan Sibol, live from Hiroshima, Japan. Sidhan Sibol, good to see you. It's a final day of this three-day summit in Hiroshima, Japan. A lot has happened, including yesterday, where there was a mini Quad summit of the group of four countries, which is Australia, India, Japan and the United States. What should we expect today? Because I understand that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will be talking to the leaders of the group of seven.
Well, yet again, today will be a long day of diplomatic engagement here in Hiroshima. Now, we know that when it comes to President Zelensky, he is going to meet the U.S. President and that will be followed by a press conference later in the day around 7:15 local time. We know that focus, of course, has been on issues like Russia-Ukraine conflict and China. The joint statement, of course, talked about the economic coercion used by China. When it comes to Russia, a lot of hard-hitting statements, sanctions, of course, expected, and of course, the American side agreeing to give F-16s to the Ukrainians. But a significant aspect has been the fact that President Zelensky himself is present in person in Hiroshima. That is seen significant largely because of the fact that he can in person have conversation with the G7 leaders, but also with the invited countries like India, Brazil. We know that yesterday he had a conversation with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in which the Indian side assured that they will do whatever possible when it comes to resolution of the ongoing conflict in Europe.
Sidhan Sibol, being the final day of this summit, what are, in your view, the major takeaways from this G7 summit?
Well, the major takeaways, of course, the dominating one has been Russia and China, but that should not eclipse what else has been happening. First, of course, the bilateral component, number of engagements that have happened. And if you look at the Japanese bilaterals, Japanese being the host, a focus has been on China, the challenges emerging from China. But if we look at the global governance architecture, G7 is seen as an important grouping in terms of that. But the big question is, at a time when there are new powers rising like India, like Brazil, the role G7 has. Now, the G7 was formed in last century based on the premise that the economic output of all these 7 countries together is one of the highest. These are developed, advanced economies. But increasingly, we have seen emergence of new economies and groupings like the BRICS, which of course now has a larger share of economic output globally than the G7. So essentially, what is the relevance of G7? And the Japanese, of course, perhaps taking that thought process in the mind, have invited countries like India, Brazil, Australia, basically trying to make sure that there is a larger conversation between world leaders. Almost 15 world leaders are present here having informal and formal conversations.
Finally, Sidhan Subal, yesterday we saw Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi not only holding bilateral meetings with a group of 7, but also with the invited 8 countries. We saw him, on a whirlwind sort of bilateral meeting with the Cook Islands. We saw him meeting the Comoros Islands representative. We saw him meeting the Brazilian president. What is the advantage of this meeting for India going forward?
Well, Eric, this is the first time the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been invited to G7. He has in the past attended the G7 summits in France and in Germany in person and with UK virtually. Now, when it comes to Japan, the invitation wasn't surprise, and given how close the relationship has been between the two countries, there has been a lot of engagement. So a visit by the Indian Prime Minister to attend the G7 was given. But how it helps India is it provides ample of opportunity to engage with world leaders. And remember, there are 15 leaders present here. Many of them are part of the G20 grouping, a grouping which is being chaired by India. India, of course, hosts the summit in the month of September. So before that, this meeting here in Hiroshima provides that opportunity for informal and formal engagements with the world leaders. In fact, earlier today, the Indian Prime Minister met with the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Yesterday, there were a whole host of meetings, including, of course, the much anticipated one with the Ukrainian President Zelensky. So these meetings feed into the larger conversation and the upcoming summit, which India will be hosting in New Delhi in September.
Live from Hiroshima, our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhan Subal. See you later. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.